Hello there, Seraphim17 once again. This is my Prince of Persia Sands of Time. No damage, no upgrades, no rewinds. This is the beginning of the game, and we will be playing this on the PlayStation 2 emulator. As you can see by the wonderful aspect ratio, we're going to be going a little bit more retro with this one than some of the ones I've been doing at the moment. I was originally going to fix it by changing some settings, but I kind of dug it, and I haven't really had many playthroughs on the channel like this, so I thought that we'd just go for that classic framing. Thankfully this time it's not forced on us during a one-hit kill survival horror game. This is a choice, but we are moving through the beginning part of the game. This game came out in 2003. Ubisoft were firing on all cylinders back in these days, and they made, in my opinion, one of the greatest trilogies ever made in video games. And the platforming in this game, the exploration, the storytelling, like the environments, the way the game lays out what it demands of you and how it expects a player to read it, all of these features, in my opinion, were very much ahead of its time, and were imitated a lot in a lot of modern games moving forward. And I feel Assassin's Creed never quite reached the peak that these games did, all considering the technology, the turnaround, and just the talent that went into making them. A couple things to note in this playthrough, guys. I'm actually playing this game at 120% speed, and it's not something that I really want to be doing. It's just if I play it at normal 100% speed, it runs at 50 frames per second and the game looks noticeably sluggish. But I'm using some compensation to get it back up to where it should be. It's just one of those problems with PAL versions of ROMs, and it feels a lot better on this particular nightly build of the emulator with the lower input delay and various other factors, so that's quite nice. And it runs really, really well without any of the artifacting I was getting on the other build that I tried. So I haven't done any of the texture offsetting, I haven't tried any of the different hacks you have to apply, and I haven't modded anything really. This is just running straight as it should. And we're fighting some of these soldiers at the beginning here and introducing the concept of wall attacking, which wall attacking is something that Ninja Gaiden came along and really edified after this game. But this game has one of the strongest wall attacks in any game I've ever played, and you can spam it mercilessly. It's a little bit difficult to control, because if an enemy is too close to the prince, you tend to have problems doing it, but if you use the jumping over enemies and attacking them and wall attacks in combination, there's almost nothing in this game that can stand up to just the sheer ferocity that's on display. But the platforming is so interesting in this game. I've always been very critical of modern platforming because I played this 20 years ago, and I just think that it was phenomenal for its time. It feels so good, and it works in establishing a parameter in which the player interacts with it, and you almost always get what you want. In many games nowadays, there's an ambiguity to some of the controls, even though they've been standardized, and some platforming, they use different ways of navigating, and it's how they identify themselves. But back in these days, I feel like Prince of Persia it nailed the archetype, it nailed the framework, and then many games came along and started tweaking with it, and it led to a lot of frustration. And I talk about this quite a lot in the projects that I've done. I've been on YouTube a while, I've got lots and lots of videos, but if you've ever seen me complain about platforming in Uncharted, or complain about platforming in specifically Darksiders 2, it's because of this game and this series. This series wired my brain in what buttons did what, and whenever any game afterwards changed that paradigm, I always felt it harshly. But another thing you'll see here, guys, is there's a lot of fade to whites on this version of the game. I don't know if the PC version has it the same. I wanted to try to cover the PC version because it does look admittedly better than this one, and there is a whole bunch of things you can do to it, but I was messing around with settings to try and get it to work, and it was just not in a right place of anything that I would even remotely call playable. You have to work quite a lot to get it into a state, and then even then I was having issues with some controls, and I just didn't think it was worth it considering the PS2 is ready to go immediately, and I'm in a bit of an emulation mood right now, coming off of the games I've been playing. You might also notice, guys, that I did ask to see what people were interested in seeing in a group of eclectic games, and this one did indeed win the poll, so it motivated me to reveal it a little bit quicker than I might have done. But I'm not really too beat up about that, because I just think that Prince of Persia is a game that deserves way more love than it gets, and because this so-called remake that Ubisoft teased and then removed is taking so long to come out. I was going to cover this many years ago, and I don't know if you remember back in, I think it was 2020. It could have been 2021 actually. 2021 I think it was. I covered the 2008 like soft reboot that the series had. And I actually wanted to cover this game then, but they announced that remake, and then we haven't really heard anything since. So I'm using this as an opportunity to put this out, and it can stand as a frame of reference to whatever that game ends up being. As we climb this awesome looking environment here that's going to get us the Dagger of Time. But before we do that, we have to do some wall-to-wall jumping. And now we've got the dagger, the game is going to demand of us to do some combat coming up, and I can start talking about what makes the combat tick in this game. The thing I love the most about Sands of Time, other than its storytelling and its relationship between the prince and I think she's called Farah, I love the elegance of the simplicity of it. They do a lot with a little in this game, and it's memorable because it's all done really well. And I think it's a testament to the art, and it's a testament to fully understanding what they were trying to make. So, combat time. So the prince can block, and the block is pretty good. You're not going to see me doing it too much because it's bound to a button I don't want to use, and if you ever see me activate the time powers in a battle, it's because I panicked and I blocked as if I was playing God of War. I am not going to be using the rewind feature in this run at all, but I might use it accidentally because of aforementioned reasons. I hope you'll forgive me. I'll try my best not to have those in the full run, but you never know. So you can block and you can evade. You can also jump over enemies, which is really good at interrupting their attacks and good at stunning them. Later on, there are some enemies that will shut down that technique, so be very careful doing it to the wrong people. But fundamentally, the most powerful thing in Prince of Persia is to jump over the enemies, do the attacks on them, and then finish them off with the dagger execution. However, there are some modifications of this combo. So when you jump over an enemy, you can press triangle and you can press square. Depending on what you press, depends on the result that you get. There is a move called a jump over retrieve, where you jump over them, you press square once, and then you press triangle to finish them. And when you do that, you will do the sword hit into an execution that steals them of their sand and obliterates them. If you do this, it is a standing animation, and it is one of the safer techniques in the game. The combat in this game is kind of unusual because the monsters don't seem to attack you while you're executing, and every so often they do. And I don't know if it's you start the execution when they start their attack. I don't know if it's some kind of pacification rule or if it's just the wonky AI, but be very careful executing near other enemies because sometimes they will just interrupt it and they'll cause damage. And the checkpoints in this game are pretty good, but they're not the best. You will tend to have to do a little bit of platforming before you can come in and do normal combat. But in this sequence here, I'm going to show you the wall attack into knockdown into the dagger. And every time you retrieve the sand, you are powering up the weapon to enable you to access some interesting things. And I apologise here, guys. I did go into the menus at the start to turn off the tutorials, and I just assumed that these were mandatory because they popped up anyway. But it turns out that I didn't successfully say that I didn't want them to be on, because you have to press X to confirm it before you leave, and I didn't do that. So for this early video, you are going to see some pretty fucking horrendous fonts popping up and telling you things, and they are useful if you don't know the game, but I've been playing this game since I was a teenager, and I don't really need it. Although I should be doing the jump over into retrieve, which you won't see me do until later on. There's a fight coming up that is incredibly challenging if you don't do that particular technique as well. And it's challenging because this game kinda uses a strange regeneration system. It seems like when you fight enemies, you fight big groups of them, but you only fight so many at once. So every time you kill one, another one seems to take its place. It's like you're killing people off an assembly line. And the combat isn't terrible. I do think it's the weakest aspect of Sands of Time, and I think Warrior Within got it way better. But it's completely doable, it's passable, and they don't have you doing it too much that it should really get in your way. What this game does best is what you're watching right now. It's going through interesting environments, it's using platforming tools, it's coming up with solutions to these traversal issues that you face. It's problem solving with a parkour edge, and later on they're going to add more complexity and they're going to introduce traps, and it's just going to get even better. And another really cool aspect of this game that you'll see a ton while we play is just the creative use of camera. There is autonomy in the camera, you can move it and make it work for you, but it's going to work for itself far more, and if you can kind of get used to it and embrace it, you will have a lot more fun. One of the biggest problems when you come back to older games is camera is just open season for interesting things to happen. And this game does like to show you some interesting angles and do some really nice cinematography, but every so often you can control it. One thing you will notice when you play though is it is a little bit close at times and it can be a little difficult to see where you're going. It can also be quite difficult to turn because the sensitivity is quite low, but I pay it gladly for an experience that is this fun and this pure on the gameplay side. You know, games are supposed to be about gameplay, and I can think of no greater aspect of gameplay than what you're seeing right now, which is an introduction to the chaining of the jump feature. And it's really interesting watching this, because back in the day when I was playing it, I felt like there was a visual language of platforming that Prince of Persia taught you really well. And you look at video games now and they've got a little bit heavy-handed with it, where everything's either painted with yellow paint or luminous or glowing, or there's some NPC telling you the frame you enter the room exactly where you should go and they're berating you to do so. Whereas in this game, the environments have been designed in such a way that they really do serve the purpose of where we are, but they also serve the purpose of giving the prince this path through the zone, and learning to read it is a skill that you will get the more you play Prince of Persia. And it's surprisingly elegant coming back here. It doesn't stand out as much as I remember. Back in the day, I could look at this room and I knew exactly where to go, and I didn't have to translate it because my brain had learnt to interpret it, whereas now I was kind of like, hang on a second, this is a little more subtle than I remember, but then you realise, oh yeah, there it is, and it is quite blaring once you have an eye for it, but before you do, you'll definitely scratch your head a few times and end up doing some plummets to your untimely demise. But here are some of the scarabs. These are scarabs of time. I don't know the names of any of the enemies in this game, guys, so I'm just going to call them stupid things. And whenever the prince engages in combat, you have to uncover his sword. You have to unsheath his weapon, or you will not do any of the combats. And it's kind of annoying that, because if you forget to do it, you'll be trying to do things and he's just not doing anything, and you'll be curious as to what's happening, and it's because you didn't set up for the fight. And then at the end of those encounters, the prince will put his weapons away, telling you that you've done it. And it's a pretty interesting system. It definitely reminds me of how on the PS2 there were a lot of games that like to kind of put everything into some compartment, and then you had these audio issues that raise their ugly head. Like, look at something like Crisis Core, where every time you go into battle there's a woman telling you you're going into battle, and it happens so much in that game that when I was doing my walkthrough I turned the bloody voices off. And then think of Zone of the Enders, you have obtained the Metatron ore. There were always these kind of interesting ways of engaging with the player to communicate what was happening, and some of them worked better than others. I don't really notice the sheathing the weapon too much, because it just gives me a really good cutting point to stitch this segmented no damage run together. But if you look on the left hand side, guys, you'll see this kind of white effect that's going around the golden orbs on my hood. That is every time I take an enemy out, I'm building towards sand powers, and I don't know if I'm going to use them too much. I'm definitely not going to use the slow motion because I'm not really interested in it. But I am going to be using the triangle to freeze certain enemies to kill them, because it's a really good tool of getting rid of dangerous opponents. And depending on what the checkpoints are like later on, I don't really know this, I don't remember this game, I should say, to the extent of just how much fighting you do. And right here, I thought this fight was an unlimited fight. That's why I used the slow-mo, because it seemed like I was killing a lot of people and it wasn't ending. And it just goes to show, doesn't it, that we've become so kind of conditioned into thinking that fights are usually going to be either short or long, and in most modern games you wouldn't fight like 30 dancers like this, even though there's probably only been about 6 or 7. But I was certainly confused as to why this wasn't ending, and every time you do the execution, you do get a little bit nervous that somebody's going to come and smack you. But as you can see, the jumping over the opponents into the combo is absurdly strong. But one thing you will notice is that there's issues with targeting. Any kind of, third-person action game in this era, even in the era right now, is always going to be scourged by problems with who you want to hit. And every so often it'll bite you in the arse, every so often it'll work really well, and you're fighting that middle ground of just what will happen next. But this is Prince of Persia Sands of Time, guys. Welcome to this run, welcome to these videos. I hope you enjoy this nostalgia trip as much as I do, because I think this game is a masterpiece. Thank you for watching, and you take care now.